Hello, my name is Otis Mensah, and yeah, first of all, I just want to thank you for tuning in right now. If you're checking this out, and yeah, I guess I want to introduce what this is. So I'm a hip hop artist. I'm a spoken word poet, and this is one of the many episodes of you know people gathering together, sharing thoughts on a specific topic, and it's closely linked to my artist residence with Sheffield University. So I'm here with some fellow thinkers, some friends, and we're going to talk about the topic of rap poetics. Um, do you guys want to introduce yourself before I get into performing the piece that we're gonna talk about?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So I'm Alex. I've just finished a PhD in the School of English at the University of Sheffield, um, focusing specifically on race, higher education, and literature. And now currently I'm working for the Arts and Humanities Knowledge Exchange team and helping to co-organize the artist in residency for Otis.
I'll go next. I'm Loma. I'm also at the University of Sheffield. I'm a second year PhD candidate studying BAME and Poetics by non-binary people and women. And I am also a Sheffield-based poet.
Amazing.
Shall I go next? I'm Seth. I'm Digital Humanities Fellow in the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield. And I'm a corpus linguist. So I look at language, English in particular, and especially semantics. And I do that by looking at texts and by examples of language in use. So things like recorded conversations, handwritten letters, etc.
I guess that leaves me. My name is Nubina Wahid. I have just finished a BA in English and Literature as a Monday, so officially I'm a graduate. Yeah, I don't have any plans for the future, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you guys so much for gathering to chat about this. I guess that leads me into perhaps a performance of the piece that we're gonna look at. And yeah, so I'm excited that we're gathering in this format, even though obviously there's all sorts of variables like tech and in this whole virtual realm. I'm really happy that we can sort of gather together and talk about these ideas. So the topic and the theme is rap poetics, and I guess I'll let Alex expand on this after I perform, but I guess we're stressing the importance of rap poetry and rap writing that stems from the culture of hip hop. I guess we're stressing the importance of that being treated with the due respect that is deserved, and I often talk about how some of my favorite hip hop artists were my favorite poets, were my favorite intellectual thinkers, and that they taught me everything I know about culture, about philosophy, about history, about race. So I guess my goal as an artist is to continue on that tradition and carry that heritage, if you will. I'm going to go into a piece called Swell, and this was taken from a new series of poetry and animation, music and animation called Otis Mensah Exists. The project itself, it has a sort of focus on a shift in perception and perspective. For me, art is always about catharsis and therapy. And the community that's created in sharing something that's vulnerable to you. However, in recent times, in the current climate that we're in, and in the midst of this global pandemic, my perception has started to steer a little bit. My perception of how I treat art, and I've started to see it as a means of documenting my existence, a desperation to demonstrate my existence and document that. And I guess that's what this poem is about. It's in the midst of the noise that the world is throwing at us, whether that's linked to racial oppression, whether that's linked to this capitalistic haze that we're all forced to chase ourselves in. So yeah, the poem is addressing that, and it's called Swell. treading on deep waters. Turbulence split me at the torso, running out of resources. Propagate a pipe dreams. Stockpiling canned goods, room full of firewood, watch the influx. We're all plotting on a morsel. Wake up to every street in your city decorated by a Starbucks and every carpool karaoke corporate slop. Bury me with my flaws and tropes, cloaks and cogs. They put a pause on hope and corset on God. Everything so poignant, improv like limp walk, born in Baal and learn the job. Craft your gal and turn the clocks. We're all free till the wages stop. Burn the plot on stage props, trade your cards and gauge the loss. It's all been made up, they wave their wands and we're the ones that's been preyed upon. A ruse and con, but who's to smirk when you's the one being used for fun? Lubricant my lexicon, slippy knowledge. Many frolic and found whiskey solace, and all we need they keep it from us like Tuskegee onsets, onslaughts, malice, minds in greasy collars, TV dinners and brain damage, and we've been too kind with the word Nazi. And you played it modest, in this grand theater of sock puppets and sleazy monarchs. Dogma's a man's best friend. And what a dog's dinner we've made. I strolled around the park on my own volition. You graced me in my empty gullet with such abundance that it wrenched my stomach. Cause it's easier to lie lame than it is to part ways. Hard faith might see you through dark days, but blasé and curdle with that banal age-old fable. Cradle oneself and smother oneself just to nurture one's self-fulfilling prophecy of habit. A generation of unordered adults left deceased from cut death. Hard luck like hard drugs, the more we have, the more we need, and on edge. When correcting the self-loathing is the only driving motive, when every rhyme is holy, you get kinda cozy. Sly is the family stone that broke me, pondering. Are my genes the chariots of my addiction? You are my affliction. Thank you, guys.
Cool, thank you, man. That was great. And I mean, already to me, a clear example as to why this sort of thing is valuable, because just you delivering it, performing it, brings new light to the lyrics that we have taken the time to read before this session. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Before we go into things, I suppose what I'll do is I'll just frame why we do feel like this is a valuable seminar, I suppose, to be hosting, as that's how we're framing it. It's certainly been my experience throughout my time at this university and my engagement with other universities in the UK, that there is a culture of trivialization and denigration when it comes to hip hop in academic spaces, and a real effort to distinguish it in some way from art forms that are more conventionally seen to be rich and deep and complex and moving, such as poetry, though the essence of both seem somewhat indistinguishable to me. That hasn't been the line, I don't think, from universities. And my feeling is, and Otis, your feeling is from our discussions and others that work on hip hop and education, is that these are based on both racist and classist logics. And this has had a massive impact on the way in which hip hop, rap music has been framed in the mainstream. And in addition, then, the way in which people who produce it and those who identify with it have also been framed in the mainstream. So it's an important thing to address both within academia and beyond. And I suppose the rap, we've lost someone. Hopefully Mabina comes back. And so the way that that it's been framed by the academia needs to be interrogated and it needs to be challenged. And the Rap Poetics seminar is a way we're looking to do that. In America and in France and other countries, there's a longer history of embracing hip hop. And whilst that's not unproblematic, we have seen in other countries a tradition of utilizing the educational and artistic elements of hip hop to enrich the experiences of students and academics and people beyond higher education. In the UK, there are examples and there are pockets of people doing that kind of work. We've got the UK edition now of Hip Hop Ed. Most recently, I've been watching the Philosophy YouTube channel, which is great. But beyond those pockets, there isn't an institutional culture that's looking to embrace hip hop. It doesn't feel like, and it hasn't been my experience. So we're here not to present a template necessarily that someone can just pick up and use, but more just to explore what a rap poetic seminar might look like, to try and not only think about changing content, but also teaching practice. Because I think that's an essential way to ensure hip hop's brought into the academia without losing some of its key components. Having you, Otis, here is essential to that, because divorcing the music from, or the lyrics from, the artist and from the element of performance, I think is a huge problem, and we should be looking to embrace more than just the written word when it comes to hip hop in academia. So, and then aside from that, framing this as just a conversation and exploration as opposed to something with a clear objective, is also important, because at the moment there's such an emphasis on these objective outcomes when it comes to seminars, when it comes to assessment, that it sort of frames knowledge in a way that it's beyond knowledge for knowledge's sake, but it's for other things, other metrics. So there are various things that I think are important when it comes to trying to change what the seminar can look like. And I think this rap poetic seminar could be doing that. And we shall see. As I say, it's an exploration. Just a very brief explanation of the format of today. We're looking to do maybe 15 or so, 20 minutes of a close reading of the lyrics to the song that Otis just performed. Looking at the more formal elements, and then after that, for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we will look more at the thematic stuff, talk about some social commentary perhaps, and all the while engaging with Otis, trying to understand about process and how that impacts on the work as well. And then maybe at the end, a 5 or so minute reflection on how that's gone, and if there was anything to be gained by approaching a seminar in this way. And just for full transparency, we've all had a look at the lyrics before this, but we haven't had any discussion about our thoughts on it. So again, like, this is an exploration. It's not really a finished product. So with that, I reckon, Otis, if you could just pull up the lyrics and just share the screen.
Most definitely, yeah.
We will get into it. Perfect. Everyone can everyone see that? All right. Cool. So I suppose, I mean, when it comes to approaching any type of close reading in my literature degree, from undergrad all the way to PhD and beyond, I just start with the first line. I find that makes a lot of sense. So just wondering, to kick off this conversation about the more formal elements, let's talk about this first line, treading on deep waters. I mean, I guess I can offer some initial thoughts of my own. I'm really keen to talk, I think, about, okay, cool, that's much better. I'm really keen to talk about, I suppose, the first 4 lines, and talk about the imaging with waters, and also the physicality of things like torso. To me, there's a mental bodily split here that I think is going to be interesting to engage with. But I've been talking a lot, so does anybody else have any initial thoughts on, if not the first line, that first kind of 4-line section? And whoever wants to jump in, just jump in.
I'm gonna jump. So I just kind of I think for me, that first section, I think it was really interesting kind of watching Oates do it as well, because it had such an intensity. I thought all the kind of really hard consonants, kind of starting off with the kind of turf treading, kind of really kind of follows through. And there's a very kind of clipped kind of syntactical pattern for me, kind of surrounding all those kind of the consonants of kind of treading and water and turbulence and split and torso. And there's kind of like a real harshness that it kind of comes in with, and a real kind of control before it allows itself to kind of ebb into sort of more kind of half rhyme and then kind of rhyme later on. I think it's kind of really important because it kind of sets the tone for the piece. And that kind of, this is a piece that is going to have kind of a lot of kind of intensity kind of embodied in it. So that's my impression of that opening.
Cool. Oh, Seth, you're on.
I agree, and the alliteration of the especially in the first two lines, treading turbulence torso. I think I noticed it when looking at it on the page, but then you really feel it in the delivery. Since what I do is word meaning, I think I just immediately kind of zeroed in on the first word, and I started thinking, so it's treading on deep waters, and treading is walking, it's stepping. But of course, here we're talking about water, so it brings to mind treading water, which is a phrase that we know, and that's staying afloat, right? It's a sort of swimming, and it's just keeping from sinking. So treading water, and that keeping from sinking is a kind of a feeling, I think, that that's there throughout these first lines. But you don't actually say treading deep waters; you say treading on deep waters.
Mm-hmm.
And since treading is walking, then it's not actually it's not actually just that you're staying afloat in the water, it's walking on water, which is miraculous and much more than just avoiding sinking.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't know if I was going too far with that, but it did make me wonder how much you were playing with that word, or also what would happen if you changed treading to walking, or if you changed
Mm-hmm.
treading to stepping or swimming, or whatever other words would be options there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm not sure how explicit I was in exploring that. I guess what you said about like the use of alliteration, for me that's so I guess integral to how the rest of the poem is going to flow, so when I'm writing it, I'm thinking of how much space in delivery the lines are taking up in order for them to send a pass to the next line. So for example, if I was to have said treading deep waters, turbulence split me at the torso, I feel that there would be somewhat of a lack of equilibrium in the two lines, whereas just the on provided me with a little more balance for moving into the next line, so it's like treading on deep waters, turbulence split me at the torso. I just feel that I guess the delivery was so integral there, and I really did want to get across this sort of harshness, and apologies if I break out into sort of, can you still see me on camera?
Yeah.
Apologies if I break out into any sort of smirks during this thing. It's very strange for me to listen to my writing being talked about, but it's amazing. It's really interesting. So yeah, I think a lot of what was directing that was the delivery. That being said, I talk often about the metaphysics of writing, and I guess it being somewhat of a spiritual experience. And my reference to spirituality, because of my upbringing, has always been sort of from the starting point has always been biblical, so I guess injected in my work are themes, whether they're carrying weight of faith within them. My work have themes of metaphors linking to biblical references. So I think, though it was way more implicit than I imagined, than you mentioned, the idea of treading on deep waters is much more of a attractive metaphor to me. This idea that somehow metaphysically, somehow supernaturally, I'm not only able to keep afloat, you're right, but able to walk through the turbulence and walk through the waves of society,
That's nice, man. Mabino, do you have any thoughts on that first section, or any other part of the song you'd like to draw attention to?
So the first section for me is it's really powerful because of the manipulation of the sound effects, because you've got the plosives, the propagated pipe dreams, you've got turbulence split me at the torso, particularly in the first four lines as well, with the measured sort of rhythm of running out of resources. For me, I felt like hearing you say that, Otis, or even repeating it myself now, it's almost as if something is being birthed out of your mouth, which is quite interesting. So it gives you a sort of introspection into the poet and what's being said. And I think that linking back to the title of Swell, it's almost as if this really important introspection or something to be reflected on is swelling out of your mouth through the sound effects, and it's coming out into the poem. And for me, it was really powerful to hear that, because it sounds violent, yet also reflective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%.
So,
can I pick up on that point, Mabina? Because I agree. I think there's something in this song. There's such a merging of real bodily things happening, and also something that's much more mental. And I think, like, to look at the first line, but then also to move on a bit, treading on deep waters. So, like, to me, the phrase is treading water. So when you start to tread on deep waters, the word deep, I'm thinking, especially knowing, like, the way in which that word is used in hip hop more generally, deep is like something that's rich with insight. So when I read treading on deep waters, I'm thinking, are you less talking about, is the waters is more of a metaphor for something mental? You're treading on deep thoughts. And when I was reading this poem or this song, and I keep interchanging those two words, which I think is almost kind of proving the point about what this rap poetics thing is. All the way through, there's so much allusion to, like, body and ingestion. You talk about food all the way through, morsel, canned goods, obviously torso. It really does draw your attention to the body. But at the same time, I have a feeling that throughout this, we're actually talking about mental state through those bodily sort of symbols, I suppose, and connotations.
Yeah.
And I think that all ties in as well to this religious element with you. There's a lot of references to God and to faith and to things like that, which are spiritual, but in sort of Orthodox religions is normally manifested physically. So there's a real interesting contrast there for me. Does anyone else want to pick up on that or introduce a new idea? Maybe we can move a bit further into the song.
I guess I just thought it was interesting what you guys are saying, kind of about the kind of gastric element to it, and the kind of inhabiting the torso, and that kind of idea of swelling and expelling something in the places. Because I do feel like there's just a real urgency that builds, like, from the beginning of this and carries through. But then also, to return to what Seth was saying, I think it was really interesting when you were picking up on that idea of kind of the idea of treading water in a survival way, or kind of walking on water in a biblical way. And I find that for me, there's like a real duality running through all of this between, like, the psychological and internal spaces and then the public spaces, because it gets very global kind of later on, and it takes things to the US, and it kind of looks at kind of the whole kind of Black Atlantic, if you will, kind of area. And I do think it's kind of really interesting that it's, on the one hand, got all of this kind of impetus and all of this kind of like drive in it, but on the other hand, there's this real kind of treading water stasis kind of thing that we were talking about, that there's this like difficulty that runs through it that is very much also meant to be there. It's not as simple as just kind of being able to drive through, like you say, there's the water in the way, there's all that kind of deep stuff in the way that's kind of interrupting. And I think it's really interesting how that kind of is married, and something so contradictory kind of has a symbiosis as we go through the piece.
Yeah. I definitely I feel that in my sort of artistic intentions when I'm writing, especially it's interesting that you both picked upon this theme of swelling links to the body, the mention of food, because though I of course intentionally put those things in there, I guess my the philosophy behind it wasn't so explicit. It was way more subconscious, and it makes me think about my journey as an artist, and how I see art. As I was saying, I see it as something cathartic, but being someone who struggles with mental health and juggling these things, whether that be anxiety or feeling overwhelmed, suffocated by what's going on in the world, the two places that I go to are writing and food. And I think these things are so closely interlinked for me. I often talk about binge eating through my work, and often when I'm and in a weird, strange way, they the two things, the two sort of addictions, if you will, one more beneficial than the other, but the two addictions, if you will, come act in tandem to one another. Often I've been eating so much food, and this you know, that's like binging this food, and then feeling the need to move from one sort of purge to another, and that other purge then ends up being mental, and that's when the writing comes. So sometimes when I'm writing this, I physically and mentally do feel that that swelling in a very tangible way, you know.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, kind of for how that kind of links into language, kind of later on as well. I think that because that's clearly like something that's, whether it's kind of conscious or subconscious, kind of manifesting so much, because there's the kind of the bile, when you say kind of born in bile and learn the job,
Yeah.
and then there's also the bits later on talking about kind of you graced me and my empty gullet with such abundance that it wretched my stomach, and this idea of kind of the ins and outs of things and the ability to stomach things and the way things are kind of forced on you, in this case by kind of capitalism and the kind of government systems and kind of racist systems and everything, and the idea that these are kind of permeating in and out of your body and being forced in and out, I find kind of a really interesting manifestation of that.
Yeah, definitely.
It occurs to me, going back even before the first line, then back to the title, that swell makes perfect sense, that it's this inflammation, and that it does relate to this gastric theme that we're talking about. But swell is also the tides and the waves, and it's not just it. I think importantly, probably swell. Again, maybe I'm digging too hard here, but swell isn't just the waves on the surface that are caused by wind. It's something that comes up from much, much deeper, isn't it?
Yeah, and this was something that I was playing with. Not only that, that's why the first line is treading on deep waters, but also I was playing with the idea of the old term, I'm doing swell. So this idea that I'm swollen, my body's swollen, which means I'm privileged because I've eaten so much food, I'm healthy, I've got this refuge, so I'm doing swell. But it's a bit of an anti. It's a bit of an anti-compliment to myself, if you will, because it's like, though I'm doing swell, like I'm surviving, I'm privileged in that sense. All these things in the world are going on. So yeah, it's the, like you said, this duality and this paradox of doing good, surviving, but are you really surviving or doing well at all, you know?
And swell is used now in that way, like she's swell, he's doing swell, is almost a satirical comment now, like in the way that we utilize it. It's I don't think it's quite a disingenuous thing to say now. Can we just scroll down a bit, because there's a particular section that I think speaks to everything that we're saying here, and I found to be like really, really interesting. I think, Loma, you brought it up. I think it's a bit further down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this one here. I mean, I just liked the line, "Dogma's a man's best friend." I thought that was just a good line, you know. But a bit lower down than that, where it says, "I stroll around the park at my own volition. You grace." Oh, a little bit further up. Bit further up. Thanks. Yeah, that's it. Cool. I stroll around the park at my own volition. You graced me and my empty gullet with such abundance that it wrenched my stomach. So that section there, to me, is like encapsulates so many of the paradoxes, the symbiosis that we've discussed. Because, I mean, for one, you've got stroll in there. So we've had treading earlier. You had running. Not too soon after, you have lying. But here we have strolling, which is the most at ease you seem to be in terms of movement. But then, I mean, the word volition already has a link to violence, just because of the way that it starts off. So there's already a sense that stroll thing is maybe satirical, or there's an element of irony there. But I'm really interested in the line after, "You graced me and my empty gullet with such abundance." So the "you" to me is interesting, because I went in two completely different ways. Initially, I thought what you were saying was, you're talking to the capitalist structures and maybe like mainstream society, where earlier on in the section you're talking about canned goods, you're talking about Starbucks, things that offer an element of satisfaction, but not one that is a deep line satisfaction, a fairly superficial one. A canned good it's not particularly nutritious, but it will keep you going. And I think with this bit, my initial reaction was that you're talking about your gullet, which already is again a very physical word, is empty. It's devoid of anything that's nutritious. But maybe materialism, the corporations, they're filling with abundance, but not abundance in terms of nutrition, abundance in terms of material good. And that wrenches your stomach. That makes you sick, because whilst it may be putting all these things in front of you, you can engage with all these material goods, you can acquire wealth, it doesn't actually appease that hunger for nutrition, which is, exactly, to my mind, the mental stuff, a richness of spirit kind of thing. But later on, I started to wonder, is there another way of reading it where the you becomes, I thought maybe a partner, or I thought, could it be hip hop? Because you graced me and my empty gullet with such abundance. So your gullet is empty because of these corporations. The abundance comes from the richness of hip hop, from the poetry, from the thought that provides you. But it wrenches your stomach, because whenever you're really hungry or really thirsty and you have like a load of water, or you have a really hearty meal, you do feel sick, because your body can't take it, having been denied it for so long. So then I wonder, is there two things? Does this poem actually have a little bit here about the wealth and richness of hip hop, and how that is something of an antidote maybe to the other issues that we're experiencing and you're addressing in this song? So I felt like there was within that one line a layer of meaning that maybe speaks to the poem at whole. I just wonder what anyone else has to say about that, or Otis, or whatever. But I found that a really interesting and exciting line to get into.
I mean, it's interesting that you say about talking about the richness of hip hop, and obviously that's something that I see so valuable and so integral to my work and inseparable, you know. However, this line from this stanza for me, I'm speaking, I'm very sarcastic here. It's sort of read like, and I strolled around the park of my own volition, and you grace me on my empty gullet with such abundance that it wrenched my stomach. Like, thank you so much for you know, sort of all these things that I have. And it links to this theme of what I like to call millennial claustrophobia. It's like playing to this theme, the fact that, and again, talking from a very privileged position, I have food in my fridge, I have a roof over my head. Yeah, I'm still so suffocated by my own complacency, by my own comforts. I believe, for one, I believe that, you know, we're no longer programming ourselves to you know, endure and survive. We're programming ourselves to maximize comfort. And so I'm starting to think about when the conditioning of that comfort, when the conditioning of needing to maximize a specific set of comforts starts to take over you, and starts to, you know, maybe control your perception of society, and therefore your perception of self, and how those two things mirror, you know. Maybe those comforts that we've been so conditioned to love, perhaps they stop you from calling out I don't know, issues of white supremacy deep within yourself, or issues with capitalism deep within yourself, or gluttony deep within yourself. So yeah, I'm approaching this stanza in a very a satire type way, you know.
I guess because a lot of what's going on in the world right now with Black Lives Matter is kind of on my mind all the time. But I just thought there was something so kind of political of that line of kind of strolling through a park of your own volition, because unfortunately we've kind of in a circumstance where that's been turned into a political statement for a Black person to walk or through any kind of space, any kind of public space. And so for me, I guess I internalize the next lines with the kind of gullet and things also as being that idea of like this attention that kind of in a hip hop sense might seem kind of positive sometimes, but actually it's that kind of like sexualization, kind of that kind of hyper masculinization, that kind of kind of putting violence, putting all these things on people that are then kind of shoved down your throat till they make you sick. That kind of hyper attention that's kind of put on Black bodies and things.
For sure. And I definitely wrote this. So this was a more recent one that I've wrote, and I think it was probably maybe 3 or 4 weeks into COVID, or into the lockdown, and that part, that line was a direct link to I guess our state of environment at the moment. It's like, oh, I can walk around the park at my own volition, all the freedoms you've granted me, how graceful of you, how thankful I am. This sarcasm of saying like, thank you so much, you know, I've got my own volition, I can go and take that into my own hands. Yet things like you said, there's still police murder going on, there's still people being raped, there's still people who are unable to sort of unlearn their conditioning of racism, of capitalism, etc. So yeah, it's sort of I wanted to create this feeling of a calm before the storm, you know, in many ways.
It hadn't occurred to me at first, but now it does, that this line is remarkably parallel to the opening line. It's strolling and treading, and okay, it's the park and it's not water, which might both be natural areas, but maybe they're two different. But then it's the turbulence splitting at the torso and the wrenching of the stomach. But then grace is that spiritual element that, you know, if that's what's in the deep water, then that's definitely what's come back here.
Mm-hmm.
I just picking up on that kind of spirituality again, that you talk about, the kind of the grace and everything. I think it's really interesting, that next section that it goes into, because I feel like the sarcasm for me was carried on in relation to spirituality. I don't feel like it was a spirituality within this was kind of a cut and dry positive force. I feel like particularly the next part where it goes on to say, after the grace line, when it goes, because it's easier to lie lame than it is to part ways, hard faith might see through dark days, but blasé and curdle with that banal age-old fable. Because I felt like, for me, maybe it's because I felt like with the kind of American references as well as the European ones above, we were in a kind of very kind of Western space. I was getting a lot of sort of quite kind of the alignment of Christianity and kind of Western government in so many ways, and how that kind of can make you seem disillusioned, because they're kind of melded together and one is used to manipulate the other and kind of vice versa, and they're both being kind of weaponized as tools for kind of shifting the behaviors of kind of normal people. And if anyone else got that kind of thing from it, or if that kind of idea of the kind of negative forces of Christianity and that kind of idea of the kind of banal age-old fables, the things that kind of were told over and over. I got a lot of sort of Christianity and kind of Catholicism and the way that's been monetized over time, and the way that's been kind of completely absorbed into the idea of capitalism. I wondered if that was kind of what you were kind of thinking about when you're constructing that sentence, Otis.
Yeah, most definitely it came in there. And I think for me, I'm always trying to make the distinction between faith and religion. You know, the institution of religion and faith. So for me, faith is something, whether I've got it in that moment or not is a different question. Whether I've got faith or whether I believe in something supernatural or other than me is a whole different argument. However, I make an obvious distinction between that and organized religion. So you're 100% right. For me, that was an acknowledgement of the colonized version of religion, well, the colonized institute of religion, you know, and it's also, it was an introduction into, I guess, my own personal journey with philosophy, because I remember reading philosophy and getting into philosophy and coming across a thinker who said something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines that if your faith can't be questioned, then you never really had faith to begin with. And I found that really interesting because and that's why I use the term hard faith. Might see you through dark days, like this sort of idea that ignorance is bliss. But sort of blasé with that curdle, banal, age-old fable. Sort of that hard faith might see you through in that you're coddling yourself and you're closing your eyes to the real world. But in reality, it won't protect you from having to face these injustices. And I guess it's also making the bigger point of nonchalantness that you often hear from a lot of people that claim to uphold faith about everything that's going on in the world, whether that throughout the vein of this piece is very it's touching on themes of the end times and the apocalypse. And I guess if you're coming from a biblical perspective, what we see unravel in Revelation, in the last book of the Bible, this idea of the end times. And a lot of people who uphold faith sort of become nonchalant about what's going on because they're like, oh well, the world's going to end anyway, and that's it, everything's going to be either made right or judgment is coming, etc., etc. So it's addressing that and sort of standing as an advocate against that and saying, look, like, that's not going to see you through. Like, oppression is happening now, people are dying right now, we need to do something about it, sort of thing.
That's interesting, man. And I think again with those two lines, faith and curdle, is this curdle? It's not technically bodily, but there's something about that word which is just kind of gross, which then brings you into relationship with your body. Mm-hmm. But then to pair that with faith is repeating a pattern that has emerged throughout this, which is this physicality and this spirituality. Really interesting. I think we should move into maybe more of a thematic conversation in a sec. Mm-hmm. But there's just one line for my own interest that I would like people to sort of chime in on, where you say, when every rhyme is holy, you get kind of cozy.
Mm-hmm. The reason that was a rapper's line. That was a rap ego line.
Well, this is the thing. That was my sense, but the reason why I bring it up is because that line is what made me, when I talked about maybe the second meaning of the section about abundance and how maybe hip hop provides you so much abundance of actual riches in the sense of nourishment and things like that. That was the line that made me start to think that way, because I was like, well, when every rhyme is a very ironic, very sarcastic song, but when every rhyme is holy, you get kind of cozy. I was trying to read irony into it, because I think that would have made sense with the tone of the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't help but just feel like there was something that made this line different to the rest. And as you say, there was a sense that maybe that's a rapper being a rapper, and that's a distinction between maybe a rapper and a poet sometimes. You do just insert a line that is...
I don't know if that's the difference, man. You see a lot of traditionalist poets upholding their ego.
Absolutely. And maybe I'm just used to reading it through hip-hop.
I think they just intellectualize their ego as opposed
to
being raw about it.
Wouldn't argue with that at all. But... yeah, this made me rethink some of the other lines and think, is there a second meaning here where actually is holy used for the first time in a non-ironic way, and cozy as well? You talk earlier in the first section about firewood and about canned goods, which is more about survival. And so again, it's food is not nourishment, food is just to get you from day to day. Mm-hmm. But coziness speaks to something more than that sort of primordial thing. Like, coziness is warmth, it's atmosphere. There's a deeper sense. There's a more of a spiritual element to that. I think it's a different plane to just bare survival. And the link with rhyme there, I'm just like, well, that's hip hop. So is there a holiness, a spirituality to hip hop here that is unironic and is actually speaking to just the richness of it? And that's what made me look back at the poem and song and think maybe there's something else going on.
I mean, this last stanza, I would argue, is different from every other stanza in that it's me now turning in on myself and going inwards on an introspection level, in a way that's not so closely linked to society. Every other way, I've been going inwards, but it's been a reflection on my internalized issues or feelings or emotions about society. This one is directly about me, and I guess I'm going into a bit of self-critique when I say, I'm looking at my cycles of addiction, my cycles of thinking, the progression in my own life, what's stopping me from getting to where I want to be. And of course, it's not inseparable from the rest of the poem, but it sort of injects me into the rest of the poem in a sort of more vulnerable way. So I begin by saying, when correcting the self-loathing is the only driving motive, meaning the I wanted to acknowledge that while all these issues are going on in society, and while all these things need facing, I feel that it's very important for people to do that deprogramming, that decolonization, etc., etc. What I'm sort of arguing from my own experience here in this last stanza is perhaps what a lot of people are sort of focused on and sort of wrapped up in is their own issues, and everyone's so suffocated by their own problems and their own cycles and their own family trauma, so much so that sometimes it stops them from actually taking on their soulful human responsibility for wider humanity and for themselves. So yeah, I'm sort of painting the bigger picture of that in society, but also addressing it within myself. Hence why when I say, when every rhyme is holy, you get kind of cozy, I'm sort of, it's a bit of a rapper stunt, it's a bit of an ego thing, but however, it's also me saying that am I doing this all out of ego at the end of the day? Is this whole, this whole rant, what is it for? Why am I expressing these artistic ideas? I can tell myself that it's therapy, and I believe that it is. However, is there some sort of external factor that's driving me to push for a career so hard in music and in art, and put myself as the ego at the forefront of that? And that's something that I battle with on a day-to-day basis of, why am I actually doing this? Why am I continuing doing this? So yeah, so when every rhyme gets holy, you get kind of cozy. I become nonchalant. I become complacent like the rest of them. So all these things that I've been critiquing, am I just upholding those very same things? And then the sly is the family stone that broke me. This is probably my favorite line, because of course it's a metaphor, double entendre to the soul group Sly and the Family Stone. But it's, sly, cunning is the family stone, my family history, my family addictions that broke me. You throw this idea that you throw a stone at a glass house and it'll shatter. Sly is this family stone that broke me. And then I go into pondering. So I'm contemplating, are my genes the chariots of my addiction? Was this written anyway? I've got this battle of determinism and free will. Was this just written anyway? Am I conditioned to a point where I can't unlearn these things? I'm thinking about, how flexible things really are and how much freedom I actually have in these things. And then it's addressing the whole poem, and it's addressing everything, mainly society, and mainly, my family trauma. You are my affliction. Like, it's my responsibility. It's also my pain. It's also my, the thorn in my foot, if you will, sort of thing.
I mean, that's so interesting to hear. There's kind of lost track of time a bit, because having finished my PhD, it's been a long time since I've close read anything, and I just love it. Maybe does anyone want to instigate a theme that we can just chat? Maybe we'll just talk about one theme that maybe feels like the most prevailing theme in the song, and we'll just talk about that as a group, and then we'll go into a little bit of a reflection on this Rap Poetics seminar, which I think has been really enjoyable and definitely an exploration for me, anyways. But yeah, maybe if we could just talk about a theme and then talk about how this has gone as a whole.
I find it a little bit hard to condense it down, because I've got kind of the overarching themes of kind of poverty and kind of working class struggles, and then the kind of dual theme of kind of government and capitalism and white capitalism kind of working in tandem, because it kind of shifts in and out of the two. So I'm kind of almost interested in the things that break the theme, actually, because for me it's so consistently kind of moving in and out of the kind of private and public parts of kind of struggle, and the kind of systematic part that kind of kind of causes it and kind of propagates it to continue, and then the kind of personal part when it moves down to the kind of physicalities of it, like the body and the kind of food and things like that. So I was kind of really intrigued by the kind of I keep wanting to say stanza, but the kind of like middle section that has things like they keep it from us, like Tuskegee, I might be saying that completely wrong, onsets, onslaughts, and then we've been too kind with the word Nazi, because and kind of the grand theatre of sock puppets and sleazy monarchs, because for me all those things, like, they open up so much for me, I guess because I'm kind of aware of kind of you being in Sheffield and things like that. Kind of I was in a very kind of UK centric place with it, and then that kind of really shifted it to kind of a much bigger sort of legacies of kind of fascism, which is all over the world, and kind of especially the Tuskegee kind of syphilis experiment, that kind of specific inclusion of that kind of experiment in Alabama, that I was kind of wondering, what was it that led you to kind of include that in this?
For me, it was really important to mention that because I was making close links to what happened in the Holocaust to the Jews. I think so often when you're having the conversation about race, especially in the UK, and the oppression of black people, white people can often, out of a place of fragility, perhaps, or out of a place of misunderstanding. You know, I'm not judging the person, but I'm judging the philosophy that led to that way of thinking. You know, often people can intercept and say, yeah, but white people suffer oppression too, and look at the Jews. I don't think it's about black and white, is it? So this is a confused sort of mind state that really upsets me, because in my family history is the death of Jews. My great granny escaped Nazi Germany, and so I have that heritage in my genes, if you will. Yet I'm able to see that actually no, perhaps something different is going on here, and perhaps there is a specific anti-blackness. Doesn't mean that white people can't experience oppression. White people have experienced oppression, and Jews have experienced undoubted oppression. However, that being said, I feel it's problematic to use that example as a means to take away attention from the anti-blackness and the oppression towards black people that's going on right now. So and that's why the line we've been too kind with the word Nazi. Like we call that what happened a genocide. Yet in Britain, there's no acknowledgement of the genocide of black people and Britain's role in the genocide. We'd much rather talk about slavery in a very polite, educational way, where Britain subtracts itself from any responsibility. So it's a bit like, actually, no, you were just as Nazi as what happened in the Holocaust. So not taking away from the trauma that happened in the Holocaust, but to also draw parallels and not take the shine away from the issues that are projected on black people in the 21st century and previously.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting as well, the kind of the idea of what you were saying about kind of what you kind of with the word Nazi and the way you've kind of paralleled them as well, because it also reminds me of the fact that kind of people use the word Nazi so kind of colloquially and say kind of like casually now, the way people will be like, oh, you're being such a remote Nazi and things like that, and it's become like this not so bad term. Almost we feel like we're so far away now from what happened that we feel like fascism is somehow aligned to history, as though it doesn't kind of perpetrate anymore, it doesn't continue anymore. And also I think it's interesting, that idea of kind of white people claiming kind of Jewish people as white when they feel like it, when of course equally they're not white when people don't feel like it, and it being like another race issue again, that again is kind of separate, because they're treated separately by different people than black people, but it being another race issue where it's kind of people moving the lines and drawing the lines, and what is whiteness, and that idea of the kind of like the Aryan whiteness being a really good place to draw that line, because that's always where people draw the line when they want to push other people out. it always comes back to the kind of the whitest form of whiteness that they can possibly draw around themselves.
100%. And I completely draw very potent parallels to the eugenics movement and the birth of race as a social construct, as a weaponized tool against Black people. That is, they're not dissimilar in so many ways. You know what I mean? And it's the same philosophy that drove them. It's interesting that you say that perhaps Nazi as a term has become a little more sort of casual. I definitely don't disagree with your experience of that, though. I think the reason why I use we've been too kind with the word Nazi perhaps because I think the opposite. I think that um, the term Nazi holds a lot of weight in a historical context, in the same way that in a way that slavery doesn't to people, which is so bizarre to me in the UK. You say slavery and it doesn't make them feel like a bit guilty because in the education system we weren't taught about Britain's responsibility, etc., or the link to modern day whiteness and what started slavery. So for me, but however, if you say Nazi or you say the Holocaust, people are immediately shaken. We know directly this is a terrible thing that happened in history. We can stand up against that. Yet when you bring up the term slavery, people are way more likely to say, well, it wasn't us, and you've got to forgive people of the past. It doesn't reflect on white people now. Whereas if you go into Germany, in the young generation, now I've got friends in Germany, and I spend a lot of time in Berlin. There's I'm not saying that there's not sort of anti-Semitism and racism in Germany, because of course there is. But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of the younger generation have taken it upon themselves as a huge burden to educate the older generation, to educate other young people about the anti-Semitism and try and sort of deconstruct that and break it down in a way that we don't in Britain about anti-blackness and how that led to our sort of a history of crime and colonization,
And Nazism is now used as a way in which to deflect from a lot of institutional structural racism or whiteliness, because it's figured as that's an example of people that discriminate, exclude due to race. I'm not a Nazi, therefore I don't perpetuate those same systems. That it's similar in America, where the KKK is used as that other alt-right example as an assumption for white people to get out of that conversation and out of responsibility. So in a way, that word is deployed in quite a strategic way, I think, to deflect from reckoning with not only historical issues of Britain and race, but also interpersonal and individual ones.
One of the other things that kind of made that line stand out to me is that's where, Otis, you're kind of explicitly dealing with what a word means. And again, that's, this is what I do, is work with what words mean. So, the idea that you would kind of explicitly negotiate that, and the process of defining or of redefining, and why we can define and redefine and what comes of it. In linguistics, there's a bit of work on kind of public-facing discourses that do explicitly define and redefine words, and to what ends. And often it's political ends, often it's social ends, often it's actually for better or worse kind of re-education or re-indoctrination. If you can take a term that people are familiar with and you can redefine it for people, then you can shift their worldview, and that could be positive or negative.
Yeah.
And this is the point where you do that or reflect on that or touch on that.
Yeah, definitely.
It had me thinking within a hip hop context. It had me thinking about how often people do that. And the first two things that came to mind, there must be lots of other examples, so I'm out of my element here, but the first two things that came to mind were the song Black by Dave, where he spends the song defining what the word black means. And then a much older one, which is Dungeon Family, and the song What is Rap, where they spend a good amount of time defining what rap is. And those are really engaging. I really like that. I like that process of kind of wrestling with what a word does and doesn't mean.
Yeah, I think in hip hop there's always a little more focus on picking apart a word than there is perhaps in the institutions of the art world or poetry. And I think that's because there is this desperation and need to put your most witty foot forward. And I'm sure that exists to some extent within traditional poetry. However, I think there's perhaps some privilege within the poetry traditional poetry world that's allowing for a little I don't know, a little allowing the artist to be a little bit more relaxed about that. Whereas I think a hip hop artist, for the most part, um, feels the need to prove what they're saying not only is witty and intelligent, but needs to be heard. And I also think that because of the history of hip hop being so closely linked to what I would call colloquial philosophy and sort of linking to the roots of the very bare roots of poetry, and that's it being a folk art and people shedding truth within the community. There was way less of a hierarchy. There's way less of a institutional body to sort of intercept in between. There's no academia there. There's simply a need to report a sense of truth and I guess on a more artistic level share stories of the community, because that exists within hip hop still very potently. I think that hip hop artists will go the extra mile to make sure that they're being understood, and will go the extra mile to make sure that they're witty in the way that they dissect the word. I think that's it's also to do with the competitive nature of hip hop as well. I think that's sort of in the seams and the threads of what hip hop or the rap, the art form of rap from the culture of hip hop is and does.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that about the hierarchy issue and that there's not one in hip hop, because I mean I think that would be considered maybe a controversial statement, because there probably are elements of hierarchy depending on how you interpret that. But I suppose the interest for me when you said that was about there's no academia involved, so there's no hierarchy. That seemed to be what you were saying. So
Yeah.
and the framing of this rap poetic seminar was almost, I suppose, implicitly and intrinsically was this is a way in which hip hop could be introduced into higher education. But there is, I think, always an underlying question with that is, do you introduce hierarchy or at least intensify it, reinforce it, once you take something like hip hop into an academy? Because do you then permit those within the institutions to, I suppose, assert their authority to use the resources, the the legitimacy of being in this place of higher thinking, to then, in the way that I suppose we've done here, we've exchanged ideas and thoughts. If we were to now put this out there as part of the academy, does that then start to institute a hierarchy of engagement with hip hop, where the community perspective, the perspective of the artist, becomes almost secondary because of the structures that currently exist in society? To me, it's been interesting. A lot of my analysis, I suppose, didn't really speak necessarily to what you had in mind initially. And I think what you learn in literature, that when you do your undergrad, that's fine, that they can coexist. The author doesn't have sole control over that meaning. But if I'm part of the academy, I have the institutional backing. I can wrench meaning from you and ensure that your viewpoint, even as artist, as musician, as local performer, doesn't have as much doesn't carry as much weight. So I think whilst this has been an assertion of hip hop's right to be within the academy, I think we always have to think about the issues that can come with it. With that being said, does anyone want to weigh in on their reflections on how this has gone, about the concept of a rap poetic seminar, and anything else that I've kind of raised in that little bit there?
I think I will, just because I suppose from like a poet kind of point of view, and someone that's kind of constantly being told that they're a very academic poet, whatever that kind of means, I find it really kind of interesting, these kind of constant kind of comparisons, because I think for me, I personally find that poetry and hip hop and rap are all essentially the same thing, that just have various kind of lines drawn around them. Because I I think I was interested in rap far, far younger than I was ever interested in poetry, because that was accessible to me. And then you shift into a different age, and poetry maybe at school becomes more accessible, and you kind of move back and forth. But I would also think in the hierarchy, doesn't kind of popular media draw a kind of structure, and the fact that those kind of the forums for disseminating media are often kind of within capitalist structures and white capitalist structures, isn't there a bit of a hierarchical kind of structure enforced by popular media in a similar way that academia is putting a structure on kind of creative academics?
I
And
totally
also,
see what you're saying.
yeah. And another thing, just with the idea of ego as well, when you guys are saying the ones that kind of rhyme or more egotistical are kind of more hip hop, I don't know if there's anything more egotistical than classical poets, because
That's
classically
what I'm
they
saying.
European white men standing on street corners talking about their lovers that nobody cares about, because they would just write this really introspective, not very able to kind of transition onto another kind of situation, kind of very egocentric poetry. And I just feel like, is there once you strip away the fact, because you can't really strip away the racial aspect of hip hop and rap and academia, they came from, like, hip hop and rap is from a very kind of black background, and academia, we are sold academia, even though it wasn't obviously from a white Eurocentric background originally, we are sold it as though it is. Is there anything other than that, really? The fact that we're told as children that one has value and one doesn't. We're told to turn off our rap music and go and study. I personally find them the same. As someone that knows that I would probably sound really silly if I tried to read any of my poems as rap, I think my lack of rhythm is like the only thing that makes one different from the other. I don't feel that you are any less of a hip hop artist for using many syllabled words or anything like that. I feel like it's the same art form. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I totally agree with you. Just to get to what you're saying, I just want to address something that Alex said. Alex, you mentioned about you don't know whether there's a hierarchy in you don't know whether you can say that there's no hierarchy in hip hop. And I can see what your thought patterns behind that. But I guess the hierarchy that I was addressing is a hierarchy solely linked to the construct of race, you know, and directly linked to colonization. So I'm talking about hip hop being a tool and a form of decolonizing. So when approaching the debate of can hip hop enter academia without it just assimilating, I think yes it can. If the right people are doing it, you know, I think yes it can, because I think it as an art form itself will have a transformative effect, because by its nature, by its history, because it came from black people, because it carries so much of the soul of black oppression like jazz does, it can only really work as a decolonizing method, and as a means of celebrating how it is a valid art form. That being said, there is a debate to sort of touch on of who is going to be leading that. I think that's where the problem is. If it's going to be led by somebody who's not already done that anti-racism work, then they do nothing but trivialize hip hop. They do nothing but fetishize. I can never say that word. Hip hop as an art form. Now, to get to what you said, Loma, about the remind me of what you said again. It was touching on the.
I think I was just sort of mainly saying that I think we sort of most of the kind of lines between kind of hip hop and rap and academic poetry have been, in my point of view, fabricated by academic institutions so that they can draw a box around something and have something to monetize and have something to capitalize on.
That's exactly the point.
Better.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. So I agree totally wholeheartedly with what you said, that hip hop and rap, that hip hop and poetry essentially no different, you know. And I think that at the core of what hip hop is, when we speak about the art form of rapping as an element of hip hop culture, you see that poetry is at its core throughout, you know, and you see that actually when you start to pick apart what rap is, it almost becomes more poetic than the fabricated traditional poetry that we now see. And that's because of this hierarchy that I talk about. When I talk about when you mentioned about the media and how perhaps could that be similar to how academia stands as this barrier in the way of of valuing the art truly, you know, and being the hierarchy. I think the difference here is that academia, poetry that exists within academia is poetry that exists within academia. It becomes over intellectualized. It becomes you know, elitist. It becomes whitewashed. When you look at how the media exists in relation to hip hop culture, you see that the relationship between the two has been way more coerced. It's been forced. You see that it's actually stemming from the same racism and the same colonizer mind state that birthed slavery, for example. You know, we see that it's a marketization of hip hop, a direct sort of intention to try and decredit what is coming from Black people, the art form that is coming from Black people, and to try and paint a bigger and wider view of the art form itself being something uncivilized, being something brutish. So then they can take an artist, let's say, I don't know, let's say I speak of an artist as an example, but, you know, I'm not just decrediting the artist's work. But let's say you take an artist like Lil Wayne, right? We know that Lil Wayne has taken on, has had a massive platform. We know that he's been celebrated by major record companies. We know that he's made major record companies a lot of money. And then you start to think about the intention to why you would market a specific artist a certain way. Because for Lil Wayne, not that I've got anything against Lil Wayne, but just using him as an example, for Lil Wayne, there's about 500 artists that I could name off the top of my head that are decolonizing in their work inherently, that are, you know, exposing truth, spreading truth, that are vulnerable, that are honest, that aren't hyper masculine, that aren't misogynistic, that aren't over capitalistic. So then you have to draw yourself back and think, so what is the intention behind pushing someone like Lil Wayne as opposed to? And it starts to, you know, sound like I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I think that that it's way more intentional than not, you know. So I would argue that that's the difference between academia as a hierarchy and the media as a hierarchy. Really, hip hop has at its core has no interest with what the media has to say, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose I get what you say. Would I be right in kind of saying that you think that hip hop is kind of pushed down in academic spaces because it's not considered highbrow enough, but in the kind of media spaces it's pushed up, but for the wrong reasons because
yeah, exactly.
Control the directionality of it.
Well, I would say that those two things that you've said are inseparable. I would say that the media marketizes a certain image of hip hop, and that's misogynistic, that's capitalistic, etc., etc. And that's why it's discredited in academia, because academia, they're so-called civilized. How could they talk about violence, etc., etc.? However, you know, the academia is not paying attention to the hip hop because, of course, it hasn't been pushed forward by the media. That is, you know, conscious, that is, you know, uplifting. Because if they were to, academia is a sort of is a sort of superpower of society. If you think about it, it's a sort of validator of society. If I walk around and say that I'm walking around with my PhD, it offers a certain level of respect that comes along with that. And I think that respect is carried throughout society, you know. So when you look at why that's the case, you start to think that perhaps it's a bigger ploy and a bigger scheme than just two isolated situations going on, you know.
I suppose that's even more reason to kind of amalgamate the two, but I suppose in the hope that hip hop subsumes academia rather than academia being allowed to consume hip hop and ruin it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That was my point in a nutshell earlier. I think that's really well done. And Otis, the points you've made there ties into the themes of your poem in terms of commodification, hierarchy, what's going to feed us, what is being fed to us, and how does that then impact the way in which we're able to go about society and things like that. Steph, I think we should probably wrap up. we've gone. Seminars tend to go over. This has gone way over how seminars tend to go over. So I think we need to wrap up. Seth, do you have any final thoughts or comments from your position on this rap poetic seminar concept?
Well, my only thought might be that it's interesting. I'm going to come back to semantics again. The power of semantics in this case. In this case, we're defining the boundaries of poetry, and we talked about earlier. Loma, you talked about defining the boundaries of whiteness, and when it's convenient to include Jewishness or when it's not, for example, and I think the deadly consequences of those semantics. And in this case, what is the boundary of poetry and what isn't, and who gets to decide, and what that offers to kind of the things that are invited into poetry and that are excluded from that circle are the consequences are profound.
Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah, Otis, I think that might be the poetic seminar exploration.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in, and thank you so much for you guys for your guys' insight. Yeah, it really means the world to me to get your views. I feel it's been super enriching and inspiriting, you know. So yeah, thank you for your time and resources.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.